Welcome to the Prospective Doctor podcast, brought to you by Med School Coach. Each week we cover topics related to the pre-med journey to medical school and beyond, from the MCAT to completing your application and from starting medical school to choosing a specialty. Our podcast will provide essential information for anyone contemplating a career in medicine.
My name is Sam Smith. I am the host of the MCAT Basics podcast and this week's guest host on the Prospective Doctor podcast. I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Shannon Sovndal. He is an emergency medicine specialist. He is also an author and a podcaster. His podcast is called Match on Fire, Medicine and More, and his book is called Fragile, Beauty and Chaos, Grace and Tragedy, and the Hope That Lives in Between. The book talks about his journey into medicine, some of the lessons he's learned throughout his career, and some reflections into death and tragedy. In this interview, we talk about his background, and he's got a really interesting story and path into medicine. We talk about what he's learned in his career, and then we talk about some advice that he has for pre-meds and medical students. Thanks to Dr. Sovndal for joining me, and I hope you guys enjoy this interview. You know, one of the things I loved about your book was some of the kind of more personal, emotional patient stories that you threw into the book. And one of those was about a little boy who had a lung infection. He ended up dying. And you come to find out later on that he was actually unable to schedule a primary care visit, which would have likely caught the infection in an earlier stage and saved his life. Is this something that you see frequently in the ER? And if so, is that something that's kind of frustrating for you?
No, I mean, I think it's more life, meaning that, there's always these downstream effects of our choices that we make early on. And we never quite know what those are. And, things that might seem simple at the moment, like missing an appointment or not being able to schedule an appointment, can sometimes become, a bigger issue, like this kid. I don't think that, in my mind, it's not like I see a lot of people in the ER and I'm like, if only they had gotten into their primary, this would have been averted. That's a much lesser thing that occurs compared to someone who smokes their whole life and doesn't stop smoking. Yeah, we're going to expect to see you in the ER. That's a kind of a bigger downhill problem,
Yeah, that makes sense. Another thing that I thought was kind of interesting is you talk about some of your earlier experiences in being a pilot and biking, and then you talk about surfing and kind of some of these more like adrenaline junkie activities. Would you say that your personality is one of the biggest influences in you going into emergency medicine, or was it a mentor? What was that big influence?
I think it just fits my personality. Being an ER doctor at this point in my career now, 20 years in, there's no other medicine that I would rather do. I don't look over and say, I wish I was a surgeon or I wish I was an anesthesiologist. I certainly explored different possibilities going through it, but also at the same time, and I always say this to people that want to go into medicine, I didn't try to tell my career to get into med school or to, get a job or to do these certain things. I just did things that I enjoyed and really followed my passion. And that led me to the career that I have. And I think, me liking to do all of those things, surfing, being outdoors, it's not, I don't consider it an adrenaline junkie, but I do like to challenge myself. I like to always be stimulated by something new. And certainly that is the ER. It's meaning we come to work and we never know what's going to walk through those doors. And I think I would be bored otherwise if I could, expect that I have 10 appointments today. That wouldn't really get me going in the morning. So I think that it does fit my personality to say, hey, I like the excitement. I like the adrenaline. I like, that's what the book's about, is that you go into medicine saying you want to do all these challenging tasks. You want to be a hero. And there's just so much more downside to it than, what I originally thought. And even when I say that, it's not so much downside, it's more emotional growth that needs to happen. It doesn't come for free, being there on the cusp of life and death and dealing with patients living and dying. It sounds like a TV show, but really it has much more weight to it. And that's what you have to learn over the experience of, your career.
Yeah. So one thing, and you kind of said it there at the beginning, I'm a pre-med, and I think a lot of people that listen to my podcast is they're also pre-meds. And so, as a pre-med, you're trying to check all the boxes, you're doing all the right things, you're trying to shadow physicians, you're trying to do research, and in a way it does feel like you're kind of just checking these boxes. But your story, it seems like you really did pursue that passion, and that's kind of where it led. So I don't know if that's more of a statement or a question, but could you speak to that? How exactly did you get into medicine? Could you just talk about kind of how you follow your passion and eventually it led you here?
I mean, in the book I talk about it. So I wanted to be a fighter pilot. That was my kind of dream job. And I ended up going to the Air Force Academy, and then I ended up losing the ability to fly from my eyes, and I, dropped out. And I was definitely kind of at a loss because that happened. I didn't know where I wanted to go. I switched my major from aeronautical engineering to economics, mainly just because, my best friend was an economics major. Like, there was no real drive there because I was kind of lost. I had lost what my vision was for my life. And then I just started to follow the things that interested me in school and extracurricular as well. And that's what led me to work on an ambulance, because I thought that would just be a really good summer job. So it wasn't like, hey, I'm going to work on an ambulance so I can go to med school. It was more, I'm going to do this. And then I really enjoyed it. And then I really enjoyed science, and I really enjoyed physiology. And that was all through my bike racing that I got. I had a coach that was a doctor. So he was a mentor, and that he talked to me about physiology, and it really was fascinating to me. And that's kind of just started what guided me to do medicine, was that I enjoyed that work. I enjoyed being in the field, taking care of patients. I like the excitement of it. I talk about it being like crack, taking care of a really sick patient. You want to do it again after it happens. And then just saying, hey, you do have to check your boxes. So the hard part about med school is it's so competitive. You do have to do well in school, and you have to, work your butt off on your MCAT, and you have to do all those things that they want you to do. But at the same time, I always tell people that you need to be you, because that's what's going to separate you from all the other candidates. So it's a combination, meaning you do have to check the boxes off, but then you have to, strive to be the best you that you can be in order to be a competitive person. And from my example of that is, I had pretty good grades undergrad, and then I decided to go to med school. I was an economics major, so I had to do a post-bac. And so I really focused. I was like, I need to get A's on all my classes, when I do post-bac. And because I was worried about my undergraduate GPA, I figured I really had to smoke the MCAT when I took it. And I took it like it was my job. And so that would be my advice to pre-med students, is like, you're in a stiff competition. It's like a bike race at the elite level, and you need to train for that. And that's how I approached med school once I decided to go. I was like, this is the same way I train to race in the state championships is the same way I'm training to get into med school. And that meant that I was very disciplined. I woke up every morning. I did a routine of studying for the MCAT so that I could get a great score in the MCAT. And then once I did that, I was like, well, what do I like to do? What's the thing that makes me different? It's not going to a lab to do research. It's, racing bikes or doing the different things that I did. And certainly once you check those boxes and you get past that first wave where they say, okay, your grades and your MCAT are good enough to get into the interview process, then they really want to see that you're an interesting person. And I don't think in any interview I spoke about anything really other than bike racing and, other extracurricular activities, what books I like to read, things like that. That was really what the interview was about when they were trying to get to know me.
There was a very interesting story about your interview process at Columbia. You sent a letter after you had the first round of interviews. And if I'm getting the story right, you were called back and you went and had an interview with the dean of admissions, or was it the president?
Yeah, that was the dean. It was the dean.
It was the dean. Yeah. And eventually getting in at Columbia. But I think that probably just highlights, the importance of after interviews and stuff, follow up, be vocal, and really show you want to go somewhere.
There's always a fine line between being annoying or overstepping bounds, but really, again, proving that you're elite or that you're different. And that is a hard line to learn. But, that is a perfect example, meaning I went to my interviews at Columbia and they went fine, but I didn't meet the dean on my interviews. And after that interview, I wanted to go to Columbia. I was like, this is the school I want to go to. So how can I put the odds in my favor that I can get there? That's where that came about, is I wrote to the dean after that interview and said, I didn't get to meet you. I want to meet you. I would love to fly out to meet you. And that's like what I wrote in that letter, in so many words. His response was the joke that I made that I didn't understand his vocabulary that he was using in my letter. But, he was like, if you want to pay for another visit out here, I'll see you if you want to come out. And obviously that move changed my career. Me writing that letter changed my life, because when I came out, I had the interview with him. And in the interview, he said, I accept you to Columbia right now, like sign the paper at my desk. And so, I always use that as an example for the rest of my career. I've always certainly remembered that. I write famous people all the time. Just as a side note, like if I'm interested in a book that they wrote, now that I wrote this book, I wrote to my favorite authors and told them that, like, hey, you inspired me to write this book. I go sleuth their email from the internet and I write them a letter, and surprisingly, a lot write me back. Like a perfect example is one of them wrote The Gates of Fire, and he's also wrote The Legend of Bagger Vance. And I wrote to him because he inspired me. And he wrote me back. He was like, great, I'm glad you have a book. We had a little correspondence. And then I've written to a few, doctors that I like who write. So I wouldn't always be shy to reach out to people, because if you're not a super famous, A-list star, then a lot of times they like to hear a personal letter or a personal note.
Oh, that's interesting. Do you happen to listen to any doctor podcasts?
I listen to MCRIT. It's probably my main podcast. That's an emergency medicine, critical care specific podcast. That's my primary, doctor one that I would listen to. I'll listen to other ones when I need a certain, I want to brush up on a particular topic. And then otherwise, the podcasts that I listen to really are based on my personality, like what do I want to learn in the moment? What am I interested in? And I definitely get on, my wife will attest to this, that I get on kicks. Like all of a sudden I'm super into Leonardo da Vinci, and I'll just study everything about him for like a month. And then I'm like, okay, now I'm on to something else, and so I kind of surf around a little bit based on my ADHD and what I'm interested in.
Lance Armstrong has a podcast, right? I don't know. Have you ever heard any of his podcasts?
I have. I mean, I worked with with Lance in cycling. So when I was, the team doctor for those 8 years, I knew him. My best friend was his coach. I helped with Floyd Landis, who, if people know the story, Floyd and Lance do not get along. So I kind of know him on a personal note. I find him interesting because he's so famous, but I don't go out of my way to listen to Lance, really.
Back to your background. So one thing that I was kind of interested in is you obviously got a degree in economics, and you say you use that on a pretty regular basis. So I was just kind of wondering, like, when you're in the ER, what are some of the ways that you're using your econ degree?
Yeah, and as a general sense, I would say, a lot of people are probably disappointed in this, but I would recommend people study something different than, medicine, so to speak. Like saying I'm pre-med, I think is a little bit of a waste of that education, because really I'm a student of life. Like there's so many interesting topics that you get to go to university and you get to learn a subject matter, from these experts. And, I would choose what interests you and then do the prerequisites as well for med school, because it just, expands your horizon. Meaning if I'm in my med school class with someone who's a biochem major, he's kind of wasting his time during the biochem lectures because he's already done this. I'm not wasting my time because I spent my time doing economics. Now I'm learning biochem. And so it's like an interesting way to think about it, just trying to expand your horizons, and everything that you learn, you can apply to medicine. And so for economics, for example, I'll just use two big tenets of economics. Economics is the study of scarcity, and it's the study of scarcity of resources and then opportunity cost. And when you look at those two concepts that you learn in economics, I use that all the time in ER, because we certainly have a scarcity of resource. So how do I efficiently move through my patients? How do I use the test the way I want them to do? If I do a test, how long does that take me? What is the opportunity cost of doing one test versus another test? And so even those general concepts, I use in medicine, because it teaches you a way to think about problems, and then you can apply it to medicine. And then on a much more sad note, so to speak, is that, economics drives medicine today, like meaning the finances of medicine. And certainly from an administrative standpoint, working in leadership roles with the hospital and flight program and EMS programs, that economics degree, things you learned is what you're applying, because you're figuring out how to run a business, and the business is medicine. And so that certainly is helpful as well.
That was something else I was kind of interested in is, I spent a summer in the ER, and by no means I was in a volunteer position. No means am I an expert or anything. But one thing I did notice is, in a good way, you take everybody that comes in and you treat everyone. And as you say in the book, it's kind of like the purest form of medicine. But what I'm wondering is, do you see a lot of the same patients come in that are maybe uninsured or know that they can't go get care elsewhere? Is that something that is frustrating, or is that something you're happy about, that these people are getting the care that they need?
Yeah, I think that changes over the maturity of your career. So maybe early on, I was more frustrated with it. I have a very open approach. I do think that if someone's presenting to the ER, for whatever their reason, they have a reason, right? And I'm there to kind of address that issue. And certainly we have frequent flyers and patients that, I know their name and they're there over and over again because they're intoxicated or because they're using methamphetamine or whatever the case is. And certainly you can say, hey, that's, it's a rough use of the system because they're constantly coming back and we're not really solving their problem. But from a standpoint of a patient coming in and being frustrated with them because they can't go somewhere else or because they don't have insurance, I'm really open to the whole thing because they're there to ask for help and I'm here to give it, and I'll try to do it whatever way I can.
So as a pre-med, something I'm interested in is, going forward, I obviously hope that I have a career in medicine, but, I also hope that I have a family. And I'm wondering if there's any advice you have for people that want to kind of balance both of those. And, what are some lessons you've learned you could pass on to the younger generation?
I'm going to say this with like a grain of salt that really what you should do is probably read my book, because that's a big part of what it addresses. And I don't make a living off of my book, just so people know, like it's not that big of a seller, but I do think that the information is really useful to pre-meds. And in part, that's who I was writing it to. It's because you have these notions of what medicine is. And really there's so much more that you could never understand, before you get into it. And there is a cost to doing it. Like I said, it's not for free. I use that analogy. You're standing on the cusp of a black hole. You're like at the event horizon. And if you can hang out there and not get sucked into that abyss, it's fantastic. But we know that a lot of providers do get sucked into the abyss, right? We have a terrible rate of PTSD, of depression, of suicide. All of these things are real. And it's because you're dealing with these hard moments, these life and death things. And then you're expected to go home and flick a switch and say, oh, I can play with my 2-year-old. Like I didn't just see a 2-year-old die. And so, those things are really hard, and it is tricky. And so that quick answer, I don't have a quick advice for someone. The quick advice is to say, hey, I was trying to be really honest in this book. I was trying to tell you really what I thought and who I thought I was and who I became through medicine. And I think that is helpful to the new provider to say, hey, I'm not alone in these feelings that I'm feeling. And it is a struggle and it is hard. And it's work. Meaning it's work to do your job in the ER well, and then it's work to come home and be a great husband and a great father, which is, my goal as well. And, you have to really apply yourself all the time. And it takes a lot of energy. It is dangerous, meaning you are sitting on that event horizon and you can get sucked into being too caught up in your career, too caught up in the stress, negative, and all of these things that can overwhelm you.
I agree with you there. I really do think, first of all, I love the book. I mean, I just love the way it was written, and it was very interesting, and I feel like I did pull out some lessons from it. So with that said, you're saying, some depression, anxiety, some of those things go with being a physician, or for some people they do. And, the term you kind of hear a lot is physician burnout. So I'm kind of wondering, your answer mimight be the same as to the last question, but what are some things you do to stay away from physician burnout? And what things have you kind of observed maybe in others where you're like, that's not a good situation?
I'll start by answering that to say, there's probably a fair number of people that listen to this and say, yeah, that won't happen to me because I'm the man or the woman and I'm tough and I'm all these things. I was the epitome of that. Yeah, I was the epitome of that starting. And I still am. Meaning if people see me working in the ER, if you watch me work, someone on the side is going to be like, wow, that guy's dialed in, right? But there's no way to hide from this stuff if you have any semblance of like a personality and emotion. Like there's just no way, like it is something that you have to deal with. And so that's the first point, is that I would pay attention to it. Don't think that you're bigger than it, because that's probably the root of a lot of the problem, is that we think we can kind of overcome it and deal with it. I think for me, it was just acknowledging that and acknowledging that, hey, we can't be perfect. We are going to lose patients. We're going to have a lot of whiffs, was my analogy. When you go up to bat and you're trying to hit the home run to save somebody, there's a lot more strikeouts than there are wins, like home runs. You just have to be aware of that and not let the kind of personality that doctors are, meaning we're perfectionists. We've done well in school. We've gotten A's. We've gotten perfect scores on MCATs. We do all these things, right? Which makes me come into medicine saying, I'm going to just roll this up and smoke it. And then it kicks your ass. And you're like, oh, I'm not used to that. I'm used to winning. I win all the time because I got into Columbia, right? Like I'm used to winning. And now my patients, don't always win with me. And so I think the acknowledgement that is the reality of it, and that you're striving for a level of perfection, but you'll never get there. And that's quite hard as well. I went to a therapist when I was in residency because I was struggling through some stuff, mentally with this. And it was a really good statement that he said. He said, hey, if you knew what you were doing with all these patients, then med school and residency would be a total waste of time for you. You're here to make mistakes, to learn, and that's going to make you a better doctor. And, realizing that is the process. The process is I don't know everything and I have to learn it as I go. And that's why they call it the practice of medicine. And it's not cliche. It's that way 20 years in. Like I still learn stuff when I go to work and I'm like, oh, I'm not going to do that again. So you're kind of always getting better at your craft.
Another thing I'm wondering here is, it seems like you have a lot of different aspects to your career. Would you just real quickly kind of summarize what like a week would look like and kind of all the different roles you play?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, for those interested in emergency medicine, it is a little unique in that the ER doctor is we actually get in trouble in residency if we said that we were an ER doctor, because the guys who ran our program said you're a specialist in emergency medicine and you can practice emergency medicine anywhere. the ER is one of the places that you can practice emergency medicine, but you can do it all over, right? So we know there's wilderness medicine, there's space medicine, you can be a doctor on a cruise ship, you can be an expedition doctor, you can be a team doctor for a cycling team like me, you can be a tactical doctor like I am, you can do EMS. So all of these things, right? I apply my craft of emergency medicine. And so what I say, when you say, what do? I say I'm an emergency medicine physician. And my job is split up by doing these various things that I apply my craft to, right? So I do shifts in the emergency department, but then I run the EMS system for our community. So that means I run the medical service for the fire department and the ambulance and the police department. I work with the FBI in Denver. And so I'm on their tactical team. I've done that since 2003. So I do missions with them, mission prep with them. And then I do flight medicine. So I'm a medical director for a helicopter. And previously, as we talked about, I was the team doctor for a professional cycling team. And so the way that week works is I have a given number of hours in the week and I start distributing them through these organizations. And it does take a fair amount of a learning period and organization to say, I've got it dialed in on how do I manage these 11 agencies that I'm dealing with. But really it's kind of a work week might be on Monday. I do a shift from 7 to 11, and then on Tuesday I ride along in the helicopter, and then on Wednesday I do QA meetings, and then on Thursday I do another shift, and then on Friday I go on a SWAT mission, and then on Saturday I do some chart review. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of flexible, and I just try to cram it in. And the good part about all this is that for me is that there's no one thing that requires me there like a banker, which I would not like. I would not like to go to the same job 8 hours a day every day. And so, if I have to do something with the family on Tuesday, I can sort my schedule out so I'm not doing something on Tuesday. But that means that I do work on some weekends. And so you're kind of just shuffling the schedule around to take care of all that.
That's interesting. And now, is there one aspect of all that you enjoy the most? Would you do one thing if you could, or do you really enjoy having all these different aspects?
I don't think I would do one thing. I mean, I really enjoy my time in the ER. I really enjoy sick patients. I know it sounds bad, but I want to have really critical patients that you got to think about. They're twisting your brain a little bit. I like the hecticness of the ER, meaning the juggling multiple patients. On the flip side, I really enjoy scene medicine. So, I'm a firefighter in Colorado and I work on an engine for a day. And so that means that if we get a fire, I'll fight the fire with the crew. I'll just be one of the crew people. But then when we get a medical call, I'm overseeing the medicine. And so that's really interesting and fun because one, I'm not, I learn a lot from, that's not my, number one trade skill here. And then, taking care of a patient on the scene is exciting because you got to think outside the box and all of that stuff. So, and obviously, things like cycling team, that's fun. It's fun to go to the Tour de France, right? It's fun to have all access to the Tour de France because you're a team doctor. So, I feel really fortunate and blessed in my career that I got to do all these things. But it, again, speaks to what we talked about at the beginning. It's because I pursue what my passion is, and you have to go after it. It takes work, meaning you have to approach, when you have an opportunity to expand your horizons or do something, you need to jump on that. Once you jump on that, you need to be really good at what you do because they're not going to want to use you unless you can perform. And so I always tell people that the number one thing in your training is to get fundamentally really good. Be really good. And if you're really good, then you can go ahead and try these cool things. And then when people see you, operating in these other environments, they're like, wow, that guy's dialed in. We want him to do this more. And that opens up, avenues for you to do. Certainly that's different than if your dream is to be a general practitioner and you want to have a great practice where you know all the families. Well, then that's the focus that you have. But your focus is to be the best provider you can be, to offer those families the best kind of wholesome care that they can get.
Gotcha. Yeah, going to the Tour de France sounds awesome. Last thing here, I just wanted to ask you about your podcast. So it's called Match on Fire, Medicine and More. What exactly is your podcast about?
Yeah, so Match on Fire, Medicine and More, the purpose of that was to give education, one. So we wanted to, give providers, good tidbits that they could take home. So the podcast is done with my wife. She's a paramedic firefighter. And so we try to give, the different perspective. What does a paramedic think about this? What does an ER doctor think about this? And really, I try to give down and dirty medicine is what I call it. We have textbook medicine where you can read back the thing that the textbook said, but really is that what we need to have when we're in the heat of battle, like in the ER? And so I try to give really good key take-home points that are practical, things that you can remember to function, as a care provider, as a physician. And then the Medicine and More is that we just expand and talk about other topics like fragile, meaning, hey, what is the cost of this on, your psyche? Or how does this make you feel? Or let's talk about another great performer in another field and bring them in, and how can we apply that to medicine? So really what I focus in on is being great at our craft. I have a training company. It's called 300 Training Group. And the focus of 300 Training Group came from a couple of things. One is that every day you need to focus on your craft. Every day you need to put a little effort in. And the jumping point for that is 300 seconds. You're not going to be great by doing only 300 seconds. But what we really focus in on is that there's no excuse to not do 300 seconds. So if you say, I want to get into med school, but I was really busy today, so I couldn't work towards that goal, I say that that's kind of crap. Meaning that if it's truly your goal, you have 300 seconds. You have 5 minutes to work on that goal, even on your worst day. So you get home from work at midnight and you got to get up at 4 a.m. I'm going to tell you, it doesn't matter if you go to bed at 12:05 or if you go to bed at 12:10. Like, that doesn't matter in the course of your sleep, but it does matter over a lifetime of trying to be great and get to your goal. And so all of that stuff is incorporated in the podcast, as well as that we're trying to get providers to not only, learn fundamentals, but really become great at their craft, at their skill set. And how do we do that? We do that through training and discipline and getting techniques to get better.
Again, I want to thank Dr. Sovndal for coming on the podcast and taking time out of his day to talk to me. Again, his book is called Fragile, Beauty and Chaos, Grace and Tragedy, and the Hope that Lives in Between.
Our mission is to inspire, encourage, and inform students as you journey through a rigorous and intricate process of achieving your dreams in medicine. Visit us at prospectivedoctor.com and medschoolcoach.com for more essential resources in your medical school journey and beyond.